All right. Welcome to the podcast, Arthur.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm looking forward to talking to you about your book Shattered, but also your other writings and your thoughts on spiritual life and emotional health, relational health.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, could we start with you uh, introducing yourself to listeners?
Sure. What do you like to know?
Yes.
I'm 66 years old. I live in Toronto. I call myself an itinerant priest. I'm an Anglican priest here in Toronto, but I've retired from salaried ministry. So most Sundays I'm out helping one church or another, preaching, presiding sometimes. I also work with a number of pastors in a supportive way to encourage them. And a big part of my life these days and my ministry is writing. And so this book that we're talking about today grew out of the writing that I've done for the last few years.
Yes.
Um,
The Before we dig into
mhm.
Shattered, how is it different than the previous books that you've written? Because you've written several.
Right. I would say that pretty much all of the other books that I wrote would fall into the category of pastoral theology. And that is that they were trying to explore particular problems or issues. And I did that as a pastor because I saw that there were concerns or needs that needed to be addressed. So, I wrote a book about church conflict, for example. I wrote a book about daily prayer. I wrote a book about the Lord's Prayer. I wrote a book about uh, how we relate to technology and how technology forms us. So what I would say is that uh, I like those books, but they were all didactic. They were teaching books. I was trying to make a point, make a case, to persuade, to give information, sometimes to challenge certain ideas. All of those things are important, I believe. But about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, I started reading books. I started noticing that there were certain writers whose ideas I loved, and I loved to read them, but I realized that I didn't only read them because I liked their ideas. I read them because they were such terrific writers. Their writing was beautiful and eloquent and lyrical. They paid attention to sentences and rhythms and alliteration and word choices, and they would carry me along by their beauty. And so I thought I would love to write in a new kind of way. I would like I don't want to write um, I don't want to write just pamphlets. I don't want to just write arguments. I want to write something that's beautiful. And
Mhm.
so I started to aspire to that, as I say, about 20 years ago. And among other things, I had this kind of dream that maybe I could do an MFA someday in writing to help me write more beautifully. And so this book is not, I think it would be helpful for people who are interested in pastoral theology, but it's not a pastoral theology book. It's a memoir. And I do have one other book that's started to be a memoir, and that was the book I wrote about walking the Camino in Spain. It came out in 2007, and if you compare that book in 2007 with the previous book that had been released in 2003, you can see that my writing was already starting to evolve, and I feel good about that. But I also feel like there was more evolving to happen since
Mm,
2007, and I hope I've achieved that with this book.
yeah. I, uh, I'm not a writer, but I've made kind of a similar shift in the
Yeah.
way I do counseling.
Hmm.
When I started out, my undergrad is in biology, and I was a research assistant at OHSU and at Kaiser, so kind of have a medical model,
Yeah.
and did cognitive behavioral therapy at
Hmm.
the start of counseling. But maybe about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years now, I kind of made a shift towards uh, therapy, a narrative approach to therapy, and
Yeah.
helping people tell their story
Hmm.
know their role, their identity in it, and uh, in a healing way, kind of
Yeah.
processing their story and shifting from the science to more the art.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and I like uh, uh, looking for beauty in writing, because it's not just inspiring and motivating.
Hmm.
I think creativity, it's also can be healing.
I
Uh,
think so too. Yeah.
seeing
I
the
think,
beauty in the world and
yeah, and I
words.
think it was Dostoevsky who said, "Beauty will save the world."
Oh,
And I, um, I don't know theologically. Sometimes I don't know how to weigh that, but I really
mm,
like the phrase. And
mm,
actually, I do say, I do. I've had a number of people in the last few years who are close to me who have lost their faith, and it's really shaken me. And people that I've known who were devout Christians when we were teenagers, and now here we are 50 years later, and some of them aren't Christians anymore.
yes.
And it really caused me to do a lot of questioning. And one of the questions I had was, well, why do I still believe? Why do I believe when my friends don't? And I have to tell you that one of the reasons,
Mm,
there are a number of reasons that I believe, but one of the reasons I believe is the gospel is so beautiful.
mm,
The stories of Jesus are so beautiful. And so I think that's really important factor to faith and to why I still believe.
mm. Yeah. The the reasons for the faith and the rationality of it is
Hmm.
an important piece of it.
Sure.
Um, but but the 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 heart, um, the emotions,
Hmm.
and is it's a huge part of our faith as well.
Yeah.
And uh,
Right.
a lot
Yeah.
of times, correct theology, and studying the Bible, uh, we can do that really well. Um, but sometimes pain and suffering in our lives make it hard to
Hmm.
trust God. It really affects our faith. But there is beauty in suffering and the overcoming of it too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and we really see that right now because we're in the Easter season, and in the lectionary, I'm an Anglican, so we go by the lectionary.
mm,
During the season of Easter, the gospel stories are all about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to the disciples. And those are all lovely stories, very beautiful stories, and they're all about restoration and reconciliation. These disciples are all hurt, they're broken. A lot of them feel shame and guilt for what they did or didn't do at the time of the resurrection. They don't know what to do with the trauma that they experienced, and Jesus steps into their lives and ministers to them each very, very specifically in a time of great, as you say, suffering. And um, and 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 the stories are just great. I mean, how can you beat the story of Emmaus or uh, Jesus making a breakfast on the beach or challenging doubting Thomas? They're all glorious stories, and I've heard them all my life. I think I said already that I'm 66, so I've been hearing these stories for probably 60 years, and they still speak. They actually, I would argue, they speak more deeply to me now
mm,
than they did before. They keep speaking to me, and the depth and the meaning goes deeper and deeper. And one of the reasons the meaning goes deeper is because I've become more and more aware of trauma, and trauma in my father's life, but also trauma in my own life. And what I see now in the resurrection stories that I didn't see, I don't think, 10 years ago, is that these disciples were all traumatized. They're all experiencing what we could call PTSD,
mm,
and yet Jesus ministers very tenderly to them and brings them to a new place.
mm. Yes. So that's a good transition, Arthur. To Can you share a little bit more about the trauma that you experienced and the trauma that your book is about, your memoir?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. So I trying to figure out uh, where to start here. My father the book ended up being, there are a number of things that are going on in the book, but kind of the main thread of what goes on in the book is my relationship with my father. And my father was a very complicated man. I loved him. I loved him a lot. I still love him. I anticipate seeing him in the next life, and I look forward to that. But he was a very driven businessman. He was focused on success and money, and he abused alcohol, and he had a terrible temper, and he did violent things. The first thing I remember was an act of violence. The first thing I remember from my childhood is witnessing an act of violence from my father, and also eventually his violence circled around and focused very directly on me. And of course, even when it didn't focus directly on me, there was always the threat of violence. And so as I wrote this memoir, more and more, I came to explore this mystery of why my dad behaved this way. My mom would say sometimes to me, he acted so crazy at times, I didn't know what to do with him. And a few years ago, as I was working in the memoir, I realized, oh, my father had PTSD. Now, PTSD is not a term that was batted around when I was a child. And even I haven't really thought about PTSD a lot. 20 years ago, a seminary student of mine was having some struggles, and she told me that she'd been traumatized and pointed me to one of the classic books about trauma by Judith Herman. I think it's called Trauma and Recovery. And I read it with great interest, mostly because I wanted to know good ways to support this student, and she had asked me to read it. And so that was very, very helpful. But then more recently, I realized, oh, my dad had PTSD, and he lived through 2 wars. The last year of World War II, he had to live in an attic upstairs while Nazi officers lived in floors below. So he had to be very, very quiet. Otherwise, he was eligible for capture and working in a slave labor camp. And then he volunteered for a very brutal war in Indonesia, one that gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. And he was also beaten by his father very, very often. And his father would beat him badly and kick him, actually, while he was still wearing his construction boots. So my father experienced a lot of trauma and had strange behavior. And he was kicked out of kindergarten on the first day of school for the rest of the year because he broke all the shovels from the kindergarten against the fence. Nobody could tell me why he did that. He couldn't tell me why. He was kind of perversely proud of it. And so so my father had PTSD. And then as I was exploring this, I started to realize, oh, all my life I've struggled with depression. I've struggled with mood fluctuations. I can get overwhelmed by feelings very, very easily. I have nightmares. I had a lot of nightmares. And I started to realize, oh, actually, a lot of what I experienced could also fit under the category of PTSD. Now, I have not been formally diagnosed, but to see things this way has been really helpful to me to come to some deeper understanding of myself and actually to regulate myself better and come to a new place. Now, I talked at such a stretch here. I don't even remember what you asked me.
Oh, well, the your father struggled with anger and violence.
Yeah.
So that's how his PTSD played out. He struggled with alcoholism. How do you think depression and PTSD, what has that looked like for you? Has anger been an issue for you?
Yes, anger has been a struggle for me and an issue for me. And as I said, my emotions get flooded and triggered pretty easily. And it's been a cause of great shame to me that at times I lost my temper. I tell one of those stories in the book. And I'm ashamed that my family has seen me at times lose control. So it has been a struggle for me, and then struggling with depression all along the way. Also, has been at times has been a cause of shame because the Christians I grew up with sort of indicated that if you're a good Christian, the fruits of the Spirit, you're not going to struggle with depression, and you should be able to conquer all that. So I've I would press it down, or would pretend it wasn't there. Or I'd put on a different front for other people, but I'd have these internal struggles going on at the same time.
Yeah. So it affected your family. They
Mm,
would see that.
they did, yeah.
How did it affect your ministry as a pastor, or as a educator, seminary professor?
Well, this is one of the interesting things about anger is that, um, when I was really young, I used to think, well, you get angry, you can't help it. Somebody triggered you, it's their fault or whatever.
Mm,
And what I eventually realized is, no, you know what? We all make choices about when we get angry, even though we might go to an out of control place. My dad made choices. He beat me up. When I was 7, he beat me up into a blackout. When I was 14, he beat me up pretty badly again.
mm,
And but once I got bigger than 14, he didn't fight with me anymore, because I would have been able to fight back in theory. I mean, it didn't happen.
mm,
But and what I realized was my dad chose his victims. I'm not saying he did this consciously,
mm,
but he did. There were some people he didn't take on, because he knew, at some level, he knew it was a bad idea. And the same with me. I didn't lose my temper in ministry, or I didn't lose my temper in seminary classes, because I knew this would be a bad idea.
mm,
And I think where the bigger struggle would be is when I was depressed. It could be really hard to be a pastor. It could be really hard to preach with authenticity, because I would feel like, well, I'm a hypocrite. I'm struggling with depression, and here I'm talking about this good news. And if you're in depression, this is another whole discussion. But what do you reveal to the people that you're ministering to? And I would say, if you're depressed, you you should not say from the pulpit, I'm depressed right now, and because that's to invite the congregation to take care of you. You have to find the right place to talk about. Just like
mm,
in counseling, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm depressed, it's not a good idea for you or for me, if I'm doing the counseling, to say, well, what a coincidence, I'm depressed too, because then you're just all mired in it.
mm,
Um, so there, you have to be very careful about the disclosure. I think one of the biggest struggles for me was, at times I felt like a hypocrite, that I was going through these struggles and then trying to portray the gospel in a different kind of way.
mm. With the shame, or the guilt of feeling like a hypocrite,
Mhm.
um w- do you think that isolated you, or made you struggle alone, or
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
mm,
No, kind of feeling sorry for yourself, that nobody understands me and I can't tell them what's going on. So, isolation is, I think, a pretty common phenomenon for people who struggle with depression. Yeah.
mm, mhm. Yeah. So um opening up and sharing your inner world with memoir,
Mhm.
more, what was it that allowed you to open up more?
Well, writing, if you allow the writing to flow, it can pull you in directions that you didn't expect to go.
Mm,
You can end up writing about things that you didn't plan on writing about. I didn't plan on writing that much about my father. I thought I would write some about him. There were other things I wanted to write about as well.
mm,
But the more I wrote the story, the more I realized this is the primary story that needs to be narrated in this text, is my very complicated relationship with my very complicated father,
mm,
that also um, parallels or contrasts my relationship with God the Father. And I talk about that in the book. And then there are also interesting connections with pastors all along the way. One thing One thing I really realized in writing the book is how important pastors have been in my life. I mean, if you had said to me a few years ago, Arthur, are pastors important to you? I'd go, yeah. And were they important in your childhood? I'd go, yeah. But as I wrote it, I saw more and more how much pastors have been helpful to me. And so I ended up dedicating the book to several people who were important pastors to me, but there are also other pastors who get married, who get mentioned along the way. And of course, growing up for me, all pastors were male. I didn't really have a female pastor until I was in my mid-20s somewhere. And 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 these pastors were father figures for me in a very positive way. They brought me to a new place. And one of the pastors was a famous pastor, Henry Nouwen, who was a priest, who was literally called father. He's literally a father figure. And something I think that probably helped was he spoke with a very thick Dutch accent. And so, like my very own parents, he was not able to pronounce my name correctly because the Dutch do not have the English TH sound. And so I think that was part of what reassured me. But those are surface things. The deeper thing is the kind of spirituality and theology that he embodied, and the way he ministered to me really helped me move to some new places.
What's one way um, experiencing trauma or anger o- affects uh, one's theology or faith? And how did Nouwen heal that or speak to that?
How did trauma or anger
Or
affect
anger? Yeah,
theology?
yeah.
So I think the danger is that we allow, if we're not deliberate and self-aware enough, we can allow our experience of trauma or our temptations for anger to form our theology. So that is, we could be angry at other people, and we're just being righteous, like the righteous God, for
Mm,
example. Um, and so we can deliver a kind of angry theology to other people, which I think I probably did early as a pastor. Sometimes my theology from the pulpit was angry and denouncing or self-righteous, or I would have said it was prophetic. So that's a danger.
mm,
Um, but I also think that we can be carried along to a new way of seeing. So I had, for example, I had some mystical experiences as a child, and those mystical experiences carried me to a new understanding of God and a new kind of theology. I had a very dramatic experience when I was 14 that I didn't talk about with people. I don't think I told anybody about it for at least a year,
mm,
but I had a vision of the Father and the Son, and they were loving, and they were viewing me with great love. And this was right around the time when my father had beaten me quite badly,
mm,
and uh, and I didn't realize even until I wrote the book that these two things happened in close proximity to each other.
mm,
But in retrospect, one of the things I realized was when my faith and ideas as a child were formed by my experience, I confused God with my angry father and assumed that God would be angry like my father and was dangerous as my father was, even more dangerous because God the Father could throw me into hell forever if I made one misstep. But that kind of mystical experience, a direct experience of the love of God, helped shift me into a place to see both the loving relationship between the Father and the Son, which of course moved me because I had such a complicated relationship with my dad. But I also saw that they loved me, and that the Father and the Son loved me, and I came to trust more and more that God loved me, not for anything that I've done or was able to do. God loved me. Period. God created me, and that is the kind of insight, really, that Henry Nouwen talked about a lot. That we too often get caught up in what he used to call them secondary loves and versus primary loves. And the primary love is the unconditional love that God has for us. And he kept saying we need to root ourselves in that. And if we can root ourselves in the primary love of God, then we don't put those demands on our secondary loves. The secondary loves are important, but you can't make them a foundation for your life, because all secondary loves will ultimately disappoint, because we're all limited and we're all broken.
Yes. Yeah. So that the being confident of and having that picture of God, uh, and the Son's love for you, that happened for you at 14 while you were experiencing the pain, and then
Mhm.
later on you had some father figures, some pastors, to encourage you. I'm curious if between like in your teen years or college or young adult years, um how did you do, um with emotions or your own sense of identity or masculinity? Because I meet with a lot of folks that uh, uh, have a conflicted or painful relationship with their father, and um and sometimes it really affects how they see themselves or how they
Mhm.
relate to others.
Mhm.
How were you doing in like high school and college, young adult
Mhm.
times?
Mhm. Well, it's a long journey and a long story,
Mhm.
but I can tell you one. I'll tell you one story and see how we're doing here.
Yes.
So when I was 20, my sister died of leukemia. She was 17. She was my only
Oh,
sibling.
wow.
She was younger than I, and
Mm,
this prompted quite a big faith crisis for me. And I
mm,
still talk about it a fair bit. Today I preached a sermon and in my church, and somebody asked me, "Was that story about your sister who died?" And I said, "Well, actually, it wasn't the sister. It wasn't my sister. It wasn't about my sister this time, but that was a reflection of the fact that she does come up often, and my wife sometimes comments, "I'm surprised how much you talk about that," because it did for me. And
mm,
so I remember really being angry with God when my sister died and having all kinds of questions and arguments with God.
mhm.
And one time when I was out praying, I went to a park. It was at night, and I went to a park that was across from our apartment building. And I walked around in the cold and I saw the stars, and they were quite beautiful and quite moving. And I was wrestling with my feelings about God and my anger towards God. And all of a sudden, I just had this sense that God was crying with me. And that was a really important turning point.
Mm,
And I realized, oh, God is suffering too. God is offering comfort and solidarity to me.
mhm,
And that was a shift in the relationship. I saw God differently. And then being at university was really good, because I I went to InterVarsity and I met many different Christians who had different expressions of their Christian faith. And so I got stretched to see that reality and theology was not quite in the narrow straits that I had grown up with. And then a funny thing that happened to me in university was one time I was in a bookstore, and in the bargain bin I saw a book. You know how bookstores have these books, sometimes you can buy them for $1 or $2. And I
yes.
saw a really cheap book that was written by a famous Catholic Jesuit priest. And I thought, well, I'm going to read that because I want to disprove him. He's really famous. He shouldn't be famous. And I read the book, and I was kind of blown away, because I realized, oh my goodness, he reads the Bible way more than I do, and way more than my friends do. And he
Mm,
prays way more than I do or my friends do. I
mm,
need to listen to this man.
mm,
And then I read some other Catholic authors, and I had the same experience, that I have a lot to learn from these folks. So that was a really important part of my development, to listen
mm.
to other Christians.
Do you remember that author?
I remember both of them. The first
Yeah.
one was an author named Daniel Berrigan, who was a very
Daniel
famous
Berrigan.
peace activist,
Okay.
a Jesuit priest, as I said. And then another book I read was uh, an unlikely bestseller at that time, was called On Being a Christian, by a theologian in Germany named Hans Kung.
Mm,
And those were the two primary ones. Yeah.
mm. Yes. Yeah. The so reading from different traditions, has been helpful for you.
Mhm.
Um, can you say a bit more, Arthur, about the process of writing and how that's been helpful to you?
So a school child at church asked me today, when did you know you wanted to be a writer? Or how did you start writing?
Wow.
And I had this inclination from early on. When I was 12, I wrote a mystery novel, a really terrible piece of writing that I've never showed anybody. It had a title, I think I called it The Eerie Tattoo Mystery. And if you read it, or The Mystery of the Eerie Tattoo, that's what it was.
Mm.
And if you read it, I'll never show it to you, but if you did see it, you would see that I was just imitating Hardy Boy books.
Yes.
And I don't know if you ever read Hardy Boy
Oh, for
books.
sure.
And there was
That's what I
even
thought of when you said
okay,
the
yeah.
title.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of title, right? And what was their friend? Joe and Frank had was his name Chet? Joe and Frank had a
Oh,
friend.
I don't remember, but I think
Yeah.
they like that was their friend, mutual friend with Nancy Drew, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I even had a character with the same name. Anyway, it was not a great book,
It
but
was an
it showed.
homage.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And not a great homage either. But that's where that's where I knew already that I wanted to write. And
Mhm.
in grade 9, that's how we say it here in Canada, grade 9. We don't say ninth grade. Sorry. I'll try to be bilingual. And in grade 9, I went to the English teacher and I told her I wanted to be a writer. And I asked her what advice that she had for me. And one of the things what she suggested I keep journals. And she gave me some ideas for how to keep a journal. So I started journaling when I was, I guess, 14 or so.
Mhm.
And I have quite a stack of journals now from over the years. And I found that journaling is a way of processing ideas. It's a way of releasing vivid feelings. It's a way of working out new thoughts. Um, so that's what I that's what I can do with journaling. And then if you do it in an eloquent and beautiful way, say with preaching or with writing, it can also be helpful to other people to work through whatever might be facing them.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I would say when I started this memoir, I think I wanted to write an account of my childhood, that's for sure. I don't think I anticipated that it would face me with some of the real darkness in my own life. So early on in writing, I did struggle with something. It sparked a crisis for me. I had some depression stuff to work on. I had some relational things to work on because of the writing. The writing helped surface this stuff,
Mhm.
and it was stuff that needed to be surfaced. I'd gone through my life ignoring some of those things or not knowing what to do with those things or shelving them or putting them off. And partly that's inevitable, right? I mean, you have to get through life, you go through school, you have a family, you have jobs,
Mhm.
so you can't deal with all that stuff. But then I came more directly face to face with it because of the writing. The writing really really brought it forward for me.
Mhm. What if you feel comfortable sharing, what's one of those things that was unearthed?
Well, I think it's the I think it's can you make it more? You want to make it more specific or re-angle that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Well, um, sometimes you can like put things aside or put it on the shelf. Um, what came up for you? Was it something that was a surprise, or was it something that you've struggled with for a bit and not had the space or time to deal with in your life?
Yeah. So I think that what I would say is that I had all my life, I'd known that there are certain things that I struggle with, but I kind of isolate them or gave up with trying to address them.
Mm,
And I didn't know what to do with them. I've gone for therapy a number of times over the years. I went for a lot of therapy the last few years, I can tell you.
mm.
And I'm sorry, I'm losing track of your question here. I
Oh,
don't know
I
why.
just you mentioned that uh you didn't start out with the purpose
Ah,
of writing about the darkness in your life,
right, right.
but it came up.
Yeah. So I think that I made the discovery, the realization, I came to the realization that my dad had PTSD. And then as I explored that, I realized, oh, I have PTSD too. I think I said that already.
Yes.
And
So that was, yeah.
if when I have the lens of trauma, a trauma informed lens, that really explains a lot about why I can be flooded by emotions, why I can be easily triggered, why I can struggle with anger, why I have depression, why I've had a lot of nightmares over the years.
Mhm.
And there is a power in naming and identifying things that are going on in your life, and then you can
Yes.
make a choice in a different direction.
Mhm.
And I don't think in the past, like I was ashamed of some of the things that I struggle with, but I never found a way to get around them or to change that. And then to see that PTSD has helped me take ownership for those things, and to
Mhm.
understand that I haven't done a good enough job of taking care of myself and paying attention to myself, and that's why I fall into these traps that are pretty predictable for me, and I don't need to go there anymore.
Ah, that's wonderful. Naming it gave you more power, more awareness of it, and
Right.
it helped free you up from the the pattern, or
Correct.
how it plays out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. The
And this takes a long time because
mm,
I did a lot of family systems, family of origin work about 30 years ago, shortly after my dad died.
mm,
Probably not a coincidence. And that was really helpful. I learned a lot, and
mm,
it made some really important changes in my life. But, my work wasn't done. There was more work to come.
yes. The uh being aware of of those unresolved issues, or the pain of the
Mhm.
past,
Yeah.
it can be like a big blind spot, or just frustrating, uh
Yeah.
that it keeps playing out, or
Right.
or repeating,
Right.
uh but yeah, that it's neat, like, uh how God can kind of change the agenda. You
Right.
think you're doing one thing, but he's got other plans,
Hmm.
and purposes
Right.
for you.
Hmm.
Um, so you you mentioned, that what you went through with your dad can affected your view of God and your relationship with God.
Hmm.
Can you say, and your dad passed away?
Hmm.
Can you say a little bit of um uh, about your relationship with him before he passed? Um, like, how much were you able to talk with him, um, about what you went through with him?
Hmm. So he was not a very talkative man. He was a very, very quiet man.
Hmm.
And he he got a terminal diagnosis when he was 63. He'd already had cancer 3 times and 3 heart attacks, and he died when he was 63. And then I tried to talk to him about things when we knew he was dying, but he didn't want to go there. And I asked about regrets, and he said it's too late to talk about regrets now.
Hmm.
And he just wasn't willing to talk about some of these hard things that we went through. And I had to come to peace with that he wasn't willing or able to do that. We had a lot of good times together. We both enjoyed the same kind of music together. So we went and heard lots of music. And before he died, both of my kids were born, so he got to enjoy the grandkids. So
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of good things.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a lot of time with him when he knew that he was terminal. Our family spent a lot of time with him. And I cared for him. It turned out I didn't realize this was going to be the case, but I cared for him the last night of his life. I was his main caregiver, and I slept in the same bed with him because he needed so much attention. The big queen size bed, king size bed that my parents had,
Wow.
and I got up during the night and helped him go to the bathroom and washed him off, and so it was a very tender kind of time. And I spoke Dutch to him all night because I thought that would be a more comfort to him. Dutch was his first language. And so we had we did a good job of caring for him at the end, and we did our best. And, probably my dad did his best too. And I'm at peace with that. And, but there are still more things that I need to say about the relationship. And as I say, I expect to see him in the next life, and maybe we'll talk about those questions.
Yeah.
And then maybe he'll have read the book and we can talk about it together.
And he'll be able to listen and
Yeah.
understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really seems like understanding that he may have had or likely had PTSD increased your empathy or compassion for him. Your
Absolutely. I
understanding.
think that's one of the really great reasons for learning about and knowing about PTSD. There was a great book a few years ago called, I believe it called What Happened to You? And it's a book about trauma. And the point that the authors are making is that so often we ask people, what's wrong with you, or what's the matter with you? That's a question I heard a lot growing up. But what we ought to ask is, what happened to you? So we elicit a story from people, and that's a way of coming to a deeper understanding of what they're going through, instead of just complaining about their behavior that seems absurd or irrational or sometimes even evil to us. Try to understand what underlies that. And that's a really good question for pastors, and we ask it a lot. What happened to you? What happened to you?
Yes.
And so again, I forgot what your question is, but I think it leads to more empathy. And you can, my wife and I have been involved in inner city ministry at various points, and we've dealt with people who are addicted or have really self-destructive behavior. And sometimes we question that. It's like, why do they do that again? Why do they engage in that kind of relationship? Why are they making these choices that seem so obviously disastrous? Oh, we have family members who do that as well. And the real question is, what happened to you? And if you start asking about addiction or trauma, lots of times you'll see trauma there that really explains what's going on. I don't know if you know the author Gabor Mate. He's up in Vancouver, a little bit north of you.
Yes.
And he says, for example, that all addiction is rooted in trauma. And I find that so fascinating. That gives me a very different perspective on how I deal with people who are struggling with addictions or other destructive behaviors.
Addiction, and I'm starting to read his book about the new normal and the relationship between trauma and health problems.
Right, all over the place.
Your father struggled with cancer and heart disease, and adverse childhood experiences really stress and strain the body.
Yes.
But it's really neat that you you mentioned that his father hurt him and was violent, and your understanding about what he went through is a way of breaking the cycle of violence and anger in your family.
You're right. And one of the things I give my dad credit for is that he actually, even though he was a violent man, he dialed down the violence. So he was not as violent as his father was. So I think at some level he knew that was, I know that he knew that was problematic, because he told me about the violence of his father, even though my father didn't confide in me about a lot of things, but he did talk about the violence of his father. And I know that affected change in how he treated me. Now, he didn't eliminate it, but he dialed it down. And the fact that he dialed it down then gives me the option to dial it down even more than he did. So these things take time. And the Bible talks about how the sins of the fathers can be passed down 2 or 3 generations, but the mercy of God goes tens of thousands of generations. And I just think, oh, that is so fascinating to think about in this context, because it is true that if there's trauma or violence within a family, it doesn't necessarily end immediately. It takes a while to be overcome. But there's a hope because God's mercy is much greater than that kind of brokenness. I love, there's a verse that gets repeated often in the Bible about Abraham's family. It's a promise that's made to Abraham. Through you, all the households of the earth shall be blessed. God says that to Abraham more than once, and it appears in other places in the Bible as well. And I think that's such a fascinating verse because, as we know, Abraham's family was not exactly an ideal family, and nor was his children's family or his grandchildren's family. There was a lot of dysfunction there. And yet God says, through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that says to me that even through dysfunctional and broken families, God's mercy can still be at work.
Right. Yes. The and the subtitle of your book, it speaks to that, right? Picking up the pieces.
Yeah.
When I listened to a few podcasts about your book, and I'll link them in the show notes.
Great.
And one as I was listening to one of them and just talking about glass and the illustration, the metaphor of glass and beauty that can come from brokenness. I remembered my father-in-law. He's passed away, but my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, they had glass shops. So he had an auto glass shop. It was very practical. And he would repair fractures and broken windshields. And then next door, my mother-in-law, she had a stained glass shop.
Really?
And they were just side by side, practical and beauty and art and creativity. And she taught people how to do stained glass. She's done stained glass for churches and different things. And those broken, there's sheets of glass, but you have to cut, or essentially you have to break them into little smaller pieces to form a different picture.
Right.
And the I just, it's such a picture of how God redeems and heals the pain and brokenness in our life.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you've seen the cover of the book, but the cover of the book has kintsugi on it. And kintsugi is the Japanese art of deliberately breaking pottery and then mending it with a precious metal. And so there's one, actually, I'll go grab, I have a bowl right here. I'm going to grab it for you. Just a second.
Oh, awesome.
So you can see an example of it here. I don't know. See, this is a bowl here that was broken, and then it was mended actually with gold. And so there's a kind of beauty that emerges from the brokenness, which I also think is true of our faith, that we see beauty emerging out of brokenness. I mean, that's what we call the Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Jesus. But you had to go through a graveyard to get from Good Friday to Easter. So I see that all over. And I see it also now he wasn't exactly a Christian theologian, but up here in Canada, we really like the work and music and lyrics of Leonard Cohen, who was theologically informed. I'm not sure he was I'm sure he wasn't theologically orthodox, but he has this line that I love. there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through.
Mm.
And so I think there's an appreciation for the fact that beauty can come through brokenness, through the mending of brokenness, through the unexpected. Life is not always nice and neat and tidy.
Yes.
Mhm.
Right.
And I think the Christianity I grew up with suggested that life should be neat and tidy, and that there was something wrong with us if it wasn't. And so the effect was we would hide from other people the aspects of our lives that were not neat and tidy.
Mm.
And that is not a way that leads to greater health or liberation.
Yeah. I think um while the cracks, that's how the light gets through. I think
Mm-hmm.
we sometimes with Christianity, evangelical Christianity, we kind of skip the reality that sometimes the cracks, that's where the darkness gets in too.
Sure.
And like you said this earlier, um like choosing, sometimes we choose to hold on to the hope, or hold on to the idea that God is good,
Mm-hmm.
and loves us,
Mm-hmm.
um and uh and like you said, the process takes time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it takes time to come to the conclusion, or just even the position that I do believe that God makes beautiful things out of brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm.
yeah. um uh and any other thoughts? Well, I this is a little bit of a shift, but I wanted
Okay.
to ask,
Fair
because
enough.
sometimes folks listening to the podcast are writers, or want to be writers.
Mm-hmm.
um and you went and to do your MFA
Mm-hmm.
for writing. Were
Mm-hmm.
you in your 50s or 60s when you went back to school for that?
I was in my, I think I was 59 when I started. In fact, I had a birthday. I turned 60 at the first or second residency.
That's
I
that's
I
that's
have a
amazing.
degree. I it's kind of crazy, but I actually average a degree a decade, and so that was my sixth degree. So now I have to think about whether I get a degree when I hit
Sixth
70.
degree. Every decade you have a book that at least a book and a degree for each decade. It's
Something
amazing.
like that, yeah.
That's amazing. The writing, writer's life and writer's journey is like such a winding road sometimes. So
Right.
do you have any uh advice, or yes, advice, Arthur, for people who are thinking about writing a memoir, or
Mm-hmm.
thinking about writing their first book, or going back to school?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, so I guess I have several pieces of advice. One is, if you want to be a writer, you need to be a reader. So read a lot and read high quality stuff.
Mm.
And um, if you read something that's beautifully written, try to figure out what makes it beautiful. You could try to analyze it. So that's
Mm.
one question.
Mm.
If you're looking at a program, I think it's really important to see who the teachers are in the program. Who are the teachers that you want to learn from?
Mm.
When I was thinking about an MFA, I talked to a writer that I really admired, and he said this is important to look at who the profs are. And I hadn't actually. It's kind of embarrassing now. I hadn't thought about that. I was just looking for an MFA that was close by and affordable, and then I realized, oh no, I need to look at who my mentors would be. That would be really important.
Mm.
I also think another important advice for writers is that you should try to write every day. Uh, and I say try to write 600 words a day. So persist, write regularly.
Mm.
And I also would recommend that you find really good peers and work with them. That for me was one of the great gifts of the MFA program, is that I made a number of friends who are writers, who are committed to art and beauty, and also committed to faith. And that was a great gift. And then I do have, out of that, there's a small group of us, four of us, who studied together. and we regularly share writing with each other and support and critique each other. And I find that that's really, really helpful.
Shout out to Sarah Sanderson, who
That's right.
introduced us, who connected us.
Sarah was in the MFA program, and she's in the acknowledgments of my books because she was one of my good friends in the program.
Nice. I just learned that she's got a book coming out
Yes.
here soon.
Yes.
So looking forward to that.
She showed us the cover, right? It looks great.
Yes.
I'm really excited about it. It's a
Yes.
great subject.
Yeah. The last question I'd like to ask Arthur is, with everything that you've gone through, how important has courage been in this process for you?
Courage. Yeah, you had that in your list of questions. And I'm not sure it's a word that I think a lot about or have applied to myself, but I guess I would say is that it's really important for us to face into the things that are hard and to go to the places that we don't want to go. And so in this memoir, I wrote about things that I haven't dealt with through my life. And, there were signals in my life that these were issues. They came up, they came up as a child. They came up when I was a teen. They've come up in between. And somehow I always managed to put them off or push them aside for whatever reason. Maybe I wasn't ready, but something within me told me in the last few years, I can't push them aside and I can't push them down anymore. So face into them. And I do find that, for example, I mentioned the family systems work that I did in the 1930s or 1930s, in my 30s. And that was hard work in some ways, but in a lot of ways, I found it liberating. Yes. And I found that my struggles with depression actually diminished greatly after I did the family of origin work, because I realized there were burdens that I was carrying from my upbringing. So it's worth doing, but sometimes it's a hard threshold to cross and to push against.
Oh, a great description of courage.
Oh, really? Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Going places that you haven't wanted to, and facing things that you haven't wanted to. Absolutely, takes a lot.
Thanks so much.
Courage to do so. So, thank you for your time, Arthur. Where can listeners learn more about you and the books that you've written, and what's next for you?
So I do have a website. It's quite simply arthurboers.com. That's a great place to look me up. You can email me through there, and you can see I've listed some of the books there, so you can see them there. You can order my latest book, Shattered. You can order it through your favorite independent bookstore, or you can go through Amazon to order it as well. I'm planning to be in the Northwest in July, and I have some things that I'm doing in Vancouver and Seattle, and also in the Portland and Salem area. That's part of the plan. And there are a number of podcasts out there. You found some of them. At least one of them is linked to my website. There are some other ones. I just did one called The Rector's Cupboard, which was quite a bit of fun.
Yes.
Great name. That's one you heard. And there's some other ones as well that are coming out in the near future.
Great. All right. Thank you. And I hope I get a chance to meet you in person on your swing through Portland.
I'm certainly hoping so too. And you're on I have a little list of people to contact when I go to Portland, and you're certainly on there. And I would love to meet you face to face. That would be a great thing. Face to face, this is good, but face to face in person is the best.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.